Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more seconds to see, to let other folks into the room from the waiting room. Thanks for being with us. We'll just hold maybe another minute and then we'll get started. The awkward dance between getting started. How many seconds do I count on my fingers before going ahead?
Exactly. And you can't read anybody's facial expression, so it's also like you just wait and see how it goes.
We'll just wait and see. We'll give folks maybe a few more seconds here and then we can get started. Okay, maybe we'll get going. So thanks everyone for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. A big thank you to FIPRA Network for getting us together to talk about the presidential debate that was on Tuesday and to look ahead to what to expect in the elections leading us into November and what to expect after the election is done. So quick introduction. My name is Mélanie Richer. I'm with Earnscliffe Strategies in Ottawa, Canada. We're one of FIPRA Canada's partners, and we are very lucky to be with Rhod Shaw today with the Alpine Group Partners in Washington, and he's a FIPRA United States partner as well. So quick introduction on Rhod brings us nearly 35 years of high-level government experience to his clients, successfully represented a diverse group of Fortune 500 companies, major international trade associations, state and local governments, and other industry leaders on matters before the legislative and executive branches of government. Really good at providing clients with critical strategic advice and has created a reputation for himself as really having a bipartisan reach in Washington. So really looking forward to having Rhod with us today and to answering our questions as it relates to the debate, his thoughts on what happened, what needs to happen, and what we might see in the next few weeks and in the next 2 months. And particularly what it means for folks tuning in and their either advocacy efforts and what they're looking forward to in the next little bit. So a quick agenda there of how this conversation is going to play out. We're going to be taking questions at the end. So if you do have questions about the debate, about the election process, and for Rhod, please do keep those for the end, and we will make sure to take those when we get there. Rhod, anything you'd like to add before we hop in?
The only thing I would just start with, because you touched on even in just the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this, is when we were talking about bipartisan, do want to lay out one ground rule, which is we will try in this conversation to be as partisan neutral as possible about the nature of what we saw with the debates, what we think is happening in the election, what this happens on policy, so that everybody can have their own opinion about who they want to vote for and what they are thinking. But ideally, what we're going to try to do for everyone on this today is give as clean a read as to what we think is happened, what may be happening, because really at the end of the day, this impacts all the work each of you do with your companies, clients, whoever it may be. And so I just wanted to lay out a ground rule here, regardless of whether Democrat, Republican, Independent. What we will try to do is stick to the middle of the road as best we possibly can, barring the fact that we all obviously have biases. And so I'm sure there'll be some bias in there somewhere, but we'll do the best we can to be right down the middle. But otherwise, thank you for the opportunity today. Happy to hopefully be helpful to everyone on the call.
I'm sure it'll be super helpful. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So maybe we'll start there with that approach that you just shared with us. What are your thoughts following the debate? You know, we talked a little bit before this, and you had some interesting perspectives on not only where the parties obviously differed. I think that was very clear of where there was some policy differences, but also on some policy similarities. And particularly what that could mean for folks tuning in today. So wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I think everyone starts conversations about the divisiveness that permeates kind of everything in the world of politics right now in the U.S. I would actually start with, I think there are some things that are people are not paying attention to, where there may be different reactions, the seed, the core driver for voters that is manifest in the parties are similar. And what I think the country is still sorting through kind of was exacerbated by the COVID situation, which is how dependent are we on the rest of the world? And so it started off kind of under reshoring, and are our supply chains set? But as we pulled that apart, what we really realized was there are a couple of things that really right now both parties are in agreement on, and that is one, there is a strong anti-China bias in each party uh, as to what is the relationship and the role that should be accommodated in policy and in trade policy with them. And what is interesting and which gets lost a lot is one of the areas of real bipartisan agreement and strength in the last couple of years has been the House of Representatives has a select committee on China that they put together with bipartisan members to talk about what are the concerns we have and what are some solutions that they can put forward. And what's interesting is you talk to Republican and Democrat members on that, they kind of all agreed, hey, if there's things that are really controversial, we'll leave those aside. We're not going to focus on the differences. We're going to focus on what we agree. And what they ended up agreeing on is a voluminous list of proposals, ideas, and thoughts. So if you start under the kind of, I would call it anti-China structure, you then have underneath that kind of a surprising agreement around tariffs. Tariffs are now an acceptable policy discussion. If you'd said 20 years ago, I would be talking to Republicans who were very comfortable and have a presidential nominee and former president who is very strong on tariffs. I think we all would have been kind of surprised. And now it's not a question of whether tariffs are a good idea or acceptable. It is not a question of which ones, right? So what you even heard in the debate was not so much should you have them, it's like which ones should have been ramped up, knocked down, et cetera. So you have that. And actually another topic that you heard come up in the debate that I think is not getting enough media attention, because I think this is really going to end up driving a lot of the agenda in 2025, regardless who wins, is home affordability. We came off of such low interest rates for so long. That topic really wasn't front and center for the political establishment. But what you're now seeing, whether or not they're going to have different solutions. It's not that there aren't differences, but I think as you talk to particularly anyone under the age of 35, 40 who's looking at buying a home, the affordability question and what should be done about that, I think is going to occupy both times. So yes, we could talk about immigration. Yes, we can talk about abortion. We can get to all those topics where there is clearly division. But I think there are some commonalities. And actually, just building a little bit on the conversation you and I had yesterday, I also would just this is a Rhod opinion, so this may be now avoiding my D or R thing. It's less that is. I do think this election is more cultural than economic. For a lot of us who were in American politics for a while, there was the Bill Clinton, it's the economy stupid. And I think that is true, except right now, I think the economy that worries and concerns about the economy are almost manifest through cultural differences. And so what do I mean by that? I think there is economic insecurity in the US, but I also think there's like even kind of like what I call a tech insecurity. People don't know whether AI is a good thing or a bad thing. Do I have to worry? I was worried about the Chinese taking my job or low-cost labor someplace taking. Now is a computer taking my job? What's happening with this? And so at a time of all sorts of kind of uncertainty, whether you believe in climate change or don't, there's people that are very worried about the future of the planet, and you lay all these things on. I think what's happening is people are manifesting their economic concerns through things that are now looking like cultural issues. And it's because whichever side you're looking at, the other team's proposals are being imposed upon me. And that worries me. So is my job being given to somebody because there's a bias towards a given demographic group? So I think that's why diversity inclusion gets to be such a hot topic. It's not necessarily, it's purely cultural. It is a cultural thing, but I think there's an economic underpinning to it. And so what's weird is I think voter insecurity at the bottom of the pyramid is actually manifest into these larger issues like trade, home ownership, anti-China, reshoring, all those things. But it starts playing out in all these social policy matters that normally would go, well, that's social and that's economic. I'm starting to think they are actually almost one and the same for people. So that's a long run-on sentence to start the conversation, but that's maybe where I would begin, I guess, with that.
Right. No, that's a really good point. I think conversations around economy used to be this high level conversation that we were having about whether our economy was strong, whereas now the conversation is, my budget is tightening. I'm having a hard time making sure that I can continue to afford the things that I used to be able to afford. And my new neighbor might be the reason that that's harder, or it might be harder
Exactly.
for me to find a home. So to your point, it's the same subject. It's being driven in a different way. But the parties also have two different views to how they confront it. And we saw
Well,
that.
that's why I think immigration, some people couch it as either a racial issue or whatnot, but it is also an economic one. If you think you're losing your job or you think you're spending money or giving benefits to people, that is actually an economic reaction to something that somebody might actually define as a cultural matter. And so I think that's a perfect example of what you're just talking about.
Right, right. One of the things that is maybe similar, or something that folks are paying attention to in this debate, but also so in the election, is the tax issue that we're going to be talking about in 2025, regardless of who is in power. How did you see that play out in the debate and going forward in the next few weeks?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think what I think people aren't paying enough attention to yet is how much is going to be put into play in 2025, regardless of who wins. And I'm sure in this conversation we'll get around to talking about like who wins or what to look for. But at the moment, regardless of who wins, you do have kind of a tax cliff waiting for U.S. policymakers in the next administration, and everybody has different ideas of each party has different ideas of what they want to accomplish with that. So for everybody on this call who is thinking about their business, whatever that may be, one, corporate tax rates are going to be in play. Individual tax rates are going to be in play. You're going to see, as we were just talking about, I think tariff policy. What is that a pay for? Is it not a pay for? How is that scored? Where do you go? What industries get most attention? I think you're going to see tariffs play a part. You're also going to see healthcare brought into that. Where is tax policy? How much revenue is available for healthcare also being a part of the discussion? And so I think the way I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, we have X percentage of our clients probably have hired us to work on tax policy over the years. And then when a tax bill happens, 100% of our clients care about tax policy. There is nobody who escapes the impact one way or another of the decisions that are made or not made. So I do think what also ties into the tax policy, and this is one of the things I think will be interesting to see whether it's a Trump or a Harris administration, regardless of your political alignment, we have spent a lot of money since COVID. Whether it was necessary or not, everyone can make their own decision, but it has been spent and put into the economy since 2020. And both parties are kind of aware we have a budget, we have a deficit problem. How you solve that, very different views on whose shoulders or who actually suffers a cut or faces a pullback, whatever you want to call it, is different. But it will also be interesting at the time you're talking about all the revenue, the pressures that are going to be there, particularly from something like the Freedom Caucus and that group and in the Republican Party. They're going to be saying, if we're going to do any of this, we've got to actually try to get our house in order. And I've been working in Congress since 1986, and my first boss was a budget hawk, and we were trying to do deficit spending. And right now, I think everybody would take the deficit we had in 1986. Right. So we haven't done a good job, and I've heard teams come into power and say we're going to tackle it and not be able to because it's painful. But I will say over the last year, as you talk to Republican and Democrat members, it does feel a little different to me. Like there is kind of like, wow, we really do have to do something. And so again, whenever you start touching revenue, the spending side is also going to get a lot of attention. So I think next Congress is going to be about as consequential as any, because those decisions generally have, a decade worth of impact. Those tend to not be, oh, we repeal that the next year. Those things tend to get set in stone as much as anything can be in town.
Mm. Maybe to close off the conversation on the debate and before moving to what the next few weeks look like, we've heard or we've read analysis in the last few days telling us who won and why. So maybe I'll ask you something different. Did Vice President Harris and former President Trump do what they needed to do in that debate? And if not, what can we expect in the next few weeks to either capitalize on what they've done or to course correct on how that debate went?
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask the other question, which is, like, what did you not expect or what did you see happen? Because in the first debate, I did not have a fight over who was a better golfer on my bingo card. And in this case, I did not have eating pets.
Yes.
So, each
a few wild cards.
There have been a few wild cards that have been thrown at us. But going into the debate, my thought was that the band of upward mobility and drop for Trump was very small. His voters know him. The public knows him. He has said things that suddenly, get off message, and the voters accept that or don't. And so I thought his ceiling and his floor was very limited. In Harris's case, I thought her ceiling and floor was actually massive. Where that could go. And so I think what you see, the common reaction kind of across the media was, and social media was, she performed well. She performed well enough to either outperform expectation or to have helped herself. And Trump probably did pretty much what people kind of expected him to do. And so I don't think there's a Trump voter who woke up the next day and said, what I heard last night just made me think I'm not going to support Donald Trump. There is a chance, and I don't know how that works, there's a chance that undecided voters might have woke up and said, didn't know her before, hadn't paid attention, or have had concerns, and might have said, maybe I'm okay with her as a candidate. So I think she net helped herself there. I would say, to me, one of the most interesting things, at least the numbers that I have seen, is the Biden-Trump debate drew 51 million viewers. The Trump-Harris one drew 67 million. So why would that matter if we're not even talking about the outcome? And the answer is, if you have a 16 million increase, and we've just talked about the fact that the Democrat malaise while Biden was the nominee was, I think, reflected in the number of who was watching. I don't think anybody felt like they had to kind of watch. It kind of felt like when you just walked around the hallways right up there, both sides kind of thought they knew how that game was going to play itself out. So I think the re-energized Democrat base probably was reflected a bit in those numbers. I have no idea whether more Republicans tune in, more Democrats, but intuitively, it feels as if you probably had undecided and Democrats going, we have somebody who is now viable in this game. We want to watch it. And the reason I think that's really important is 16 million out of a country of 330 million may not sound like a lot, but in a country where 158 million people vote, and actually the margin between Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in the last election was 250,000 votes total. 16 million people showing up, trying to be enthused one way or another, carve them out proportionately across all the states. That's 20,000 suddenly new excited voters in Pennsylvania. That actually can make a difference. So I think it's not just simply who won. I think that momentum the Democrats felt, and I think they were worried about the debate. If it didn't go well, they were like, whoop, we may have lost the momentum. The fact that she performed well enough and that many more people were watching, I think the Democrats generally have to leave, and they do, as they have been talking, whether you read it or you talk to them, feel very good about what happened. And I think if you're Republicans, I think they generally say, actually, that's who he is. We've known who he is. He's won with that. If he's won before with that, he can win again with that.
Right, right. Almost like the voter apathy has gone down, and you have more people tuning in, like tuning in to the debate, but also just tuning into the election. It was interesting to me to hear you talk about the universes of Trump has capitalized on his universe and has those folks parked with him, whereas Harris's universe is a little bit bigger because folks are maybe not parked with her yet. So seeing how that plays out in the next few weeks is obviously interesting if you've got one candidate who's kind of at the top and another one that has room to go down or room to go up. So it'll be interesting to see in the next few weeks. On that, I wanted to talk a little bit about who do you think is going to win and why that is, or what to pay attention to figure out what those answers are. If the answer is I don't know, what should folks who are watching be paying attention to as issues or perhaps areas to determine who might win this one?
Yeah, it's a obviously that's the $1 trillion question. One of the stats, I'm actually going to make sure I pull this out right. In the last election, if you took Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and you looked at the margin, and then you looked at the number of people who voted in the United States, 0.15% of the voting population, or the voters, determined the president of the United States. 0.15. So if you're in touch with the 0.1% of voters in the United States, you can predict it. I am willing to admit I am not. So I don't know how to assess that cleanly. And it's also interesting, and I know I mentioned this to you yesterday. One of the things I find really fascinating, I'm going to pull the number up because I wanted to make sure I was not off on this. In 2016, in Wisconsin alone, President Trump got 1,400,000 votes. What was interesting to me at the same time, same election, the combined vote count for the Republicans who were running for the House of Representatives was 1.45 million, i.e. 50,000 more people voted for House Republicans than they did for president. So the reason I highlight that is, who are those 50,000 people? Who are those 50,000 people that woke up in Wisconsin on election day and said, I'm going to go vote. I'm going to make the effort. I'm going to go, bad weather, good weather, whatever it may be, lines, whatever. I'm going to go, I'm going to vote, and I can't figure out who to vote for president. Or maybe I did vote for the Democrat, not clear, but I didn't do that. So who are those 50,000 in 2024? I don't know. That is hard to tell, but that's partly why I think things get interesting. The other number that I think is interesting is Pennsylvania. And everyone's always asking for shorthand, what to watch, what to look for. My parents are always asking, like, so what should we pay attention to?
Pill? Yeah.
Exactly. And so, my indicator species is Bucks County. And the numbers I find interesting there is in 2020, Biden beat Trump by 16,000 votes. Okay. They had a margin. In this cycle, since that time, Republicans have focused on that being an issue, and they have changed actually Republican to Democrat registrations in Bucks County to where they're now up 1,000 or 200, 300 voters in just party registration and affiliation. So they also have looked at what is usually a telltale community in Pennsylvania that makes a significant impact and moves significant numbers. And you'd say, well, we're talking, 16,000 votes. And the answer is yes. Well, Pennsylvania was decided by 20. So, that county alone, as you watch what is suburban, affluent, suburbs where people tend to fight over suburban white women, college educated, that whole dynamic. Well, there you go. There's a community to take a look at that. So it's not like this NBC News is putting Bucks County polling up. I do understand that, but if you're looking at numbers or you're trying to assess something and you get any granularity, I think Bucks County is interesting. The other place I think is interesting is what's going to happen in Michigan. Michigan was decided by 100,000 plus votes last time, and what is interesting is the Democrat schism they have right now. It has a very large Muslim population in the Detroit area. They have been that community has been very engaged and very expressive about what's going on with Israel in Gaza, and they're talking about they won't vote or they may vote for the other side. And the question I have on that is, for a lot of them that are young, do they care? Are they prepared to vote for a Republican or a Democrat based on Palestine, Israel? Maybe. But what happens then when you say, how about what you think about climate change? How much would you think about when you think about school debt? How much when you think about abortion? How much when you run down the checklist of issues? Is that one thing going to be enough to either make somebody vote or stay home? And how does that work? And again, in a place where it's a significant community in Michigan, and again the state was decided by 100,000 votes, that will also be an interesting tell. So if I'm looking at another community, I would be looking inside Michigan numbers for what's going on in Dearborn. Talk to me about what Dearborn, Michigan looks like, what that congressional district looks like it's doing. And I think at that point, if you can figure out who are those voters in Wisconsin that I can't begin to understand why I voted and I didn't vote for the same team. And tell me about what's going on in Pennsylvania. Look at something like what the turnout in Bucks County looks like. And you talk about Dearborn. Amazingly enough, someone would say that seems very micro-targeted for a country this big. And the answer is 0.1% of the population is going to pick the next president of the United States. I was talking to Frank Luntz a couple of months ago, and Frank was like, we're going to spend $3 billion affecting 0.1% of the U.S. population. Like the rest of us are going to have to watch the ads.
Right.
But everyone's chasing 0.1% with all that money, all that time. And that does appear to be true today. And I think what the debate did was guarantee that moves forward. I think that was not going to be the case if Biden had been on the ticket. I don't think that's the way Democrats were feeling weeks and weeks ago. Today, I think it's viable, and those communities are the ones that are going to matter.
Right. There wasn't a path, or they didn't see a path maybe beforehand. And now this puts it into play.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, we've all written those communities down, and we're all going to go take a look at that community's voting record and all the details on that. But one question that I wanted to ask you, and this is a question that our clients or the folks that we work with in Ottawa are often asked as well. What do you advise people who are looking to talk with elected officials in between times? What do you recommend for this interim period? We obviously still have a little bit less than 2 months to go. What would you advise folks to do who want to continue those building relationships in the next little bit, in this time of we're not sure how it's going to land on election day?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time with our clients talking about these things as well. I mean, I think some of this sounds very trite and simple, but sometimes those are the truisms. Really at the end of the day, whoever has won is going to arrive in Washington, D.C. in January 2025 in spite of probably any of K Street's best efforts. The public is going to kind of figure out who they send here. And so there are a couple of things that are still timeless, regardless of if you're an advocate, that don't go out of style. One is integrity and substance. What policymakers are struggling with is they have only one finite thing, and that's 24 hours a day to work with their team and themselves. And they have a myriad of issues they can focus on: tax policy, Middle East policy, in energy, environment, education, housing, picket. And so really, regardless of what your political affiliation or your bent is, you've got a finite window to work on a finite number of topics. And what they're looking for, who walks in the door and says, I have a topic that I think is of political value to you to work on. I think this is going to matter to your voters. And I've got a solution, a problem, something to point out to you that will speak to them and therefore is worth your time. And align, I believe, having been a chief of staff on the Hill and had to kind of sort through these things, is the average congressional House member has 780,000 constituents. So that's, each person has 5 problems. So now we got 4.5 million problems, and I got 24 hours as a member of Congress, right? I've got to sort through which ones matter. And I'm sure there are unscrupulous people who say, are you on my team? And I'm going to talk to you and I won't talk to somebody else. Sure. Human nature is human nature. But I think in a lot of cases, what people are looking for is, are you local? Does your company, does your goods, your service impact people back home? If they do, is it a problem? Is it a problem I think I actually want to work on? Do you have a solution? Have you thought about what I need to be able to even help you and to do that? And if you do those things to a certain degree, at some point you have to give up on worrying about the weather. I can't control what the weather will be in DC. I can control whether I'm prepared. I can, pack the jacket or not. Pack the jacket. You may not have to wear it. So I would say at this point, keep your head down and kind of, what I would argue is kind of do the right thing. The other thing, if you're really looking for the safest kind of lily pads to stand on, it's work with the governing caucus people. Each team has, everyone that gets press and coverage are the folks that are out at the extremes. There's a lot of members in the House and the Senate and people that are working the administrations that are somewhere in between that. And so if you can work with them, whether they end up being a majority or minority, they're going to be part of the working machination. And so, pay attention to what, I guess I call the governing caucus. And then the final thing is, I think one of the biggest mistakes is an error of omission, but not necessarily an act that is wrong. And that is, why do members of Congress have to spend time raising money? Why do presidents have to do it? It's because they have to advertise. They have to get to the media. And so if the number one thing they have to think about is articulating that message, why don't more corporate clients think about in the interim, what are they doing via their social media? What are they doing with their media relations to help make it easy for a policymaker to say, I want to prioritize your issue, I want to work with you, and I know people back home are going to know this is happening, so that they're not a tree falling in a forest and nobody hears it. And so I would also just underlay that, whether that's true in this little window of time, but it's true over the long term, be thinking about how you help illuminate or articulate and reinforce what policymakers are doing that you like. And if you decide you want to articulate the things you don't like they're doing, that's your call. But I would think those three: kind of integrity, find the folks that are trying to work on things, and try to do the things, mimic what they want. If they're trying to get it onto Twitter or X, maybe you should be trying to actually reinforce that on that kind of platform.
Right. Finding ways that you're also helping them that solves your problem at the same time.
Yeah.
Your approach has been very bipartisan, and you touched this on your last kind of discussion there about that core group in the middle. And I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit, because we often see, the loud stuff on the extremes. That's what media likes to cover for the most part. And you don't cover the flight has gone safely. You cover the when the flight doesn't go well, right? So maybe talk a little bit. I could, if I could get you to reflect a little bit on that, on how things don't happen without that core group working together to make stuff happen. So despite the noise, that's still ongoing for folks who may be a little bit further away from the Hill.
Yeah, I mean, this Congress has been difficult even for that universe to get things across the finish line, because the U.S. Congress has had a hard time with a speaker like that is usually not your starting point problem mid Congress. So the governing caucus does struggle, and those folks working together struggle. But it is interesting when you talk in the hallway, or you know somebody well enough that you're having some other kind of level conversation with the principal themselves. They're usually looking for somebody on the other side of the aisle to team up to work, because they know it makes it easier. Because also the other thing the sophisticated legislator knows is I don't know who the next administration is going to be, so I don't know who's going to sign at the executive desk. So if I think it's great, my team has, the House, the Senate, and the White House, it's great. I probably don't have to worry about it. But let bills take more than a year or two to become law. And so am I positive year 3 or 4 when this might become law? I have all 3. I may not. So maybe it's good hedging for me to figure out, can I find somebody for this so that when the day comes, regardless of who's in the White House, they will sign what I'm lucky enough to get through. And so I think anybody who is spending time identifying the people that think like that is great. And then the other thing we try to do is actually do matchmaking. When you're talking to a Republican senator, say, have you talked to this Democratic senator about that? I think you guys might find commonality. Sometimes they don't know they're on the same path. Or Senate people, have you talked to House people? House people, have you talked to these Senate folks where you might be able to smooth your pathway a little bit? So the majority of members here fit in that bucket, I would say, in the House and the Senate. They don't get coverage. They don't get accolades. And they also struggle. The story I've explained to people, I have that Animal House vision of the good angel and the bad angel on the guy's shoulder trying to decide what happens. But a real story, I'm standing in the hallway with a member and a tweet goes out. As we're standing here, he looks at it and it's from his team and it's inflammatory. And he goes, if I retweet this and I escalate this is probably good for me. I can probably raise money off this. I can do all sorts of things, but I'm uncomfortable with that. Like, what should I do with that? Now, he made the right moral decision in my mind of what he wanted to do or not doing that. But that kind of dynamic is just out there all the time. So if you're in the middle, you're getting pulled because you see what the rewards are in the system on that. And that's also what has made Washington hard. And I think people don't appreciate this fact for leadership. It's very easy to shoot at the leadership of both parties and be grumpy with them. Leadership, when I was on Capitol Hill, had power. They could put you on a committee or take you off a committee. They could help you with campaign support. They could do all sorts of things. They had levers to use. Today, actually, if they take you off a committee, social media writes it up, you're a martyr and you do better. You can probably raise more money by doing something inflammatory and attacking somebody in leadership than anybody could ever help you with. Ironically enough, at a time where we look at a lot of concentrated, quote unquote, power at the top, but they don't have the authority to compel, kind of agreement amongst their own team because the system is now rewarding those who go rogue. Right. And that's a natural human reaction when you look around and say that person's got it easier than I do if I just say this, if I just do this. So it's a complicated place for corporate America to operate because people are keeping score. There's lots of different scorecards now. It's not just D and R. There's, progressives and there's squad inside of, the moderates and the blue dogs and the Democrats, let alone Freedom Caucus and, pick your groups. So everybody is struggling with what scorecard do we use? How do we operate? And it's why I go all the way back to the origin story question. The one thing that does not go out of style is be honest, tell the truth, have integrity, try to have your facts straight, and help people know what they're at least deciding to do or not do, and then try to make sure if they want to help, that you're making sure they get rewarded for it in a way they get rewarded if they run rogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the instant gratification echo chamber is hard in this context, and is not a context that was in play beforehand.
Yeah.
I have maybe one final question before we go to the question. So maybe while I ask that to you, I'll ask folks if you have questions to put them in the chat, or if you'd like to ask them out loud, we can always do the raised hand. So maybe I'll ask folks to start doing that while I ask you just a final thought on, we talked about the economy, but what it means for people instead of this high level, and of course housing affordability and immigration, and how that all ties in together as issues that will be determining for this election. I wonder if you have any thoughts on any sleeper issues, or on any issues that you're paying attention to in the next few weeks that may be pretty big vote determinants as well.
The issue I think may get a lot of attention here that is not really received as much is the housing and the homeowner one. I really so here's a global one. So coming out of Basel, there's this requirement for financial institutions to have higher capital requirements. So the question is, will like the U.S. require that on U.S. banks? And my not an expert on this topic, but my sense is doubt it, because while yes, you may be concerned on both sides of the aisle about how solid our banks are, et cetera. If I suddenly improve, if I require a significant change in the capitalization, that's less money to lend, and that means they're going to have to start ferreting out the lower income, lower, FICA score homeowner. And that goes very counter to what they're all trying to address at the moment. So I think you might see it play out. And again, that's an obscure regulation. But I think a couple of months ago when I started thinking, I think this is going to start to emerge, it wasn't really on, I don't even think it was a part of, not that I think about it, I'm not sure it was in the Biden-Trump debate, was last night or 2 nights ago. You're starting to see it once your radar turns on, you realize, this is starting to show up. So if I had a sleeper, I would say home ownership, housing affordability, that may be, new. I don't think anybody's sleeping on immigration. I don't think anybody's sleeping on abortion. I don't think anyone's sleeping on where you stand on climate or not. I mean, I think most of the things are baked. And when we get to the 2025 agenda around tax, a lot of that is so obscure and so far down the line, it's hard to get. Other than I would say, Trump, I think, made a very interesting political decision when he was in Nevada to talk about tips and whether that would be taxed. I don't know how that works. I've talked to a number of tax councils, or like there's all sorts of challenges around this, and every business is suddenly going to now say, pay me $1 and then the rest can be in a tip. Like I don't know how that actually works itself, but it was interesting to see something like that just pop up that suddenly took traction, because in a voting demographic like Nevada has, that was probably a very smart topic to at least put forward.
Home ownership and home affordability is a big one up here in Canada. I just turned 34 and I bought a home on my birthday, and the comparison to my parents who had homes at 21 is a wild thing to really compare, but very topical with of course my universe and folks who are like me, looking at the same kind of things.
You talk about the difference between your parents and yours. In my world, my parents remember when they were happy that their mortgage rate dropped to a 15% interest rate. And they're like, you're complaining about 4 or 5%. So it's also, it is an interesting, if everything is a perspective of a snapshot in time.
Yeah. One of the conversations playing out here is exactly that, people being unable to afford their mortgage renewals and what that means. Yeah. I'm not seeing any questions pop up, so I'm just going to keep asking you questions if that's okay. Folks. Oh,
sorry, there are a couple.
I don't see them.
Do you see them in the Q&A?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at the chat here. Apologies. Okay, I've opened it up here. Great. Charles, I'm going to go with you because I had written that one down. CUSMA, USMCA or NAFTA, as folks know it, is obviously happening in 2026. So wondering what your thoughts are on that, how each candidate could maybe approach that, particularly in a time where, you mentioned earlier the tariff, when you were talking about tariff, it's very America first, with both sides of the aisle. So how do you see that play out?
I think it's going to be a real challenge, and it's not less a challenge about U.S. Canada, and in some ways, it's not even so much about U.S. Mexico. There is this growing concern in the U.S. that Mexico becomes the nearshore China opportunity, and so you have a lot of questions over, okay, if our CHIPS Act, tariff policy, trade policies all work to kind of draw a little bit of a moat around the United States with China. Does China get around that by coming into Mexico, building them there, and then that product comes into the U.S.? So you look at vehicles where the U.S. has got concerns about, are they spy machines on wheels? So you have the whole data and the privacy and that kind of communication. You also have just, are they so far ahead and or subsidizing so much around electrification, et cetera, that normally you would say, well, if it was made in Mexico, this would be fine. Well, I think you're going to see a lot of questions now about what's the provenance of everything, working further and further back than we might have in the most recent negotiations, let alone going back to the original Clinton era policy. So I think it's going to be harder because we started what are the things that everyone's unified around? This idea of reshoring. Who is friendshoring? Who are those people? What do they qualify as? Again, you hear much less about concerns or problems with Canada. And it's not so much that people think like there's a quote unquote Mexico is the problem. There is a thought that Mexico either by design, depending on the administration, or inadvertently becomes a pathway for things people don't like. I would also say one of the other dynamics there is going to be labor and how that plays, because you had labor speaking at the Republican convention. Whatever you thought about how that went down, that also is pretty unique. That is a different statement. So when you see this administration work very closely with labor, when you look at the Progressive Caucus's agenda for 2025 and 2026, a lot more labor organizing, labor concerns, worker protections. At the time you then have this deal come up, I think you have at least some Republicans led by Trump with a different relationship and openness to working with labor and unions, some of them. And so I think that will also make it a little more difficult, regardless of who's in power.
And I think we saw, maybe not through the renegotiations, but you mentioned the Canada piece. A lot of the representatives from those states that work or really depend on trade and working collaboratively with Canada were maybe a little bit louder, regardless of what side of the aisle they fell on.
Well, and also, as you know, we touched on what is one of the major hot points is immigration. Well, immigration is also the border security. And so how even products flow, what are the rules, how difficult, how attractive is it for US companies to be bringing things from Mexico? All those things are also, I think, going to be a little more difficult as we move forward, because those two issues are going to be so entwined. They tend to be used synonymously, but they are different.
Right.
And so I think that also will complicate what those negotiations look like. But this is not your 1992 Republican and Democrat Party talking about North American trade.
Right. We've got a question here on the abortion ban, and I might touch on this because this is something that I've been obviously paying close attention to, particularly how that conversation has also evolved to be a conversation on what IVF looks like too. And interesting context when you're having that conversation about abortion, you're having the conversation about IVF with Governor Walz and his personal story, his family story. We had even Taylor Swift weigh in about the IVF conversation earlier this week. I wonder, as we look at the electorate being 51% women, we have potentially a candidate who could be the first women president in the United States. That wasn't really talked about much at the debate, which was interesting. I wonder what you think of this issue and how it may or may not shore up support in the next few weeks with that electorate.
My read on that is colored by the fact that you've seen Trump speak to it differently several times here recently, which means he also is seeing
the impact,
the importance and the power of that is a potential differentiator for voters. And so I don't know. For Democrats, it's clear. Chuck Schumer could schedule IVF votes probably for the remainder of the year. He would do so, right? I think they see that as being very net positive for their ability to tract over that last 1 or 2% that they believe they're going to need. I think the fact that President Trump has such a strong, dedicated base around whether it's evangelical, Christian, religious. Actually, it was interesting. I saw some really interesting polling that basically, if you identify yourself strongly religious, whether that's Jewish, Muslim, Christian, you are going to be disproportionately supporting Donald Trump. It was interesting is if you are of faith, and that is front and center, you are supportive. The fact that you're seeing him try to figure out how I can handle a little bit of this, whether it's 6-week, 15-week, IVF, all those things, I think is a sign that he may have more to say on this topic between now and the election, and I think that could actually have impact.
Right. Interesting. That's a good point. It's like they've recognized that there's an impact there that maybe they didn't expect.
Yeah.
We've got a few other questions here. Is there a tipping point of anti-China rhetoric or policies where both parties feel like they've extracted enough?
Interesting thought. I haven't figured out what is a bridge too far. So far, no. I don't think, because again, when you're talking about tariffs, that is going to raise the cost on Americans, and well, they're all worried about inflation. Everyone's worried about affordability issues across the economy: food, housing, healthcare. Interesting that at this point nobody has said, well, this tariff is too much. If anything, you have somebody say, well, I'm going to double the tariff on this, or I'll do more than you, or I'm going to leave this one in place. And so at the moment, something that would directly end up impacting a consumer's wallet, which we would think would be the number one thing, which would temper how far you go, doesn't really seem to have happened. So I don't think I see the end yet. One of the things that could change that is if maybe the Chinese suddenly, quote unquote, improve their posture on Taiwan, and that might actually make somebody say, well, we can work with them now because they've stepped back on this front or that front. I don't think that's likely, but I mean, there are things that could change that. But for the moment, I think it's a race to who can outstep one another on China. Nobody's at this point thinking throttling back at all.
Right. We have a question here on the IRA, and we touched on this yesterday, so I'm glad somebody asked. But to what extent would a future Trump administration roll back provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act? And I'm thinking too, what might be interesting is, folks or companies have changed their business models sometimes to, bring in clean energy, either policies or whatnot. So that could have a massive impact either way. So wondering what your thoughts are on what that could look like.
Yeah, we wrote a memo a couple months ago on what I thought if the Republicans took control, House, Senate, White House, what's on the chopping block from the IRA. And so I guess if somebody wants that, I'm happy to share that with people, because we did spend time thinking about that. I actually don't think it all gets rolled back. My parallel to this was the Affordable Care Act. Republicans are like, when we get in power, we'll completely repeal it. And turns out that's very difficult when people started availing themselves of it. In this case, when you talk about, well, there's all these problems with it, I think it's going to be surgical. I do not think it will be a guillotine. And so, look, if you're a consumer who is buying an electric vehicle because you like the $7,500 tax credit, I would do it now. I will be surprised if that's available 18 months from now. That doesn't feel like one that survives. If you talk about the production tax credit or investment tax credit for businesses, energy companies to become more efficient, create green power, there's billions, I don't know, trillions of dollars that are now committed in the pipeline from corporate America to do those things. Even if philosophically there are Republicans who don't like that, there's all politics is local. At some point, how many politicians say to their local guy who said, wait a minute, I've got all this money at risk, you can't possibly do this. I think it's going to be surgical. I do not think it will be wholesale repeal. And again, the parallel to me is the Affordable Care Act, where they've tried to nip at things that were particularly problematic, but this feels fairly well baked, barring Republicans taking the House by 300 votes and the Senate by 70 votes and the president, with 330 electoral. And and even then, I think localism will actually have some play on that.
Right. We've answered most questions here. There's just one last one that maybe I could ask and ask for your closing thoughts of what we should be maybe reflecting on after this. But the question here is, some undecided voters felt Harris was not forthcoming about her agenda, despite numerous references to her plan. Given that she's still unknown relative to Trump, how big of a problem is that for her in the next few weeks?
So, okay, so this will have to be, I guess, Rhod opinion, but my take on that is the way this election is boiling down. You have 100% of the people familiar with Donald Trump. Yeah. They again, I think his ceiling floor is fairly well identified. I think in her case, ceiling and floor is much more variable. And I think for her, as long as she and her debate proved viable, I don't know if there's a lot of folks out there who are putting their finger in the wind to decide whether or not there's a single policy difference between the Democrats and the Republicans that will impact their vote as they are. Who do I think I identify with? And this is why I go back to maybe this is a useful closing. It's why I go back to, I think this is cultural. Mm-hmm. I think what voters are trying to go is, do you hear me?
Right.
Who hears me? So each topic fits into the bucket of who hears me. And I think when Harris's case, and I think that's probably why she said it fairly often in the debate, like, I will be for everybody. I will be for. Mm-hmm. Now, should she have said something in my mind that spoke to what a conservative, a moderate Democrat, a whomever that needed to hear her give her something specific? Maybe she thought that was fracking. I don't know. But I think there's an opportunity here for her to just go, I am a viable alternative to Donald Trump. And is that enough? That may be the game, the strategy that they are playing with. So again, I think Trump's numbers are set. The relative number is how many people get excited, show up and vote. How many people in Dearborn stay home? That if they don't think she's viable and they don't like that answer and they're unhappy about the Democrats' position on Gaza, that could be enough for Michigan. And maybe that more than I think does the outcome of one of those policy decisions suddenly make somebody go, oh, I was thinking about Harris, but she's wrong on this one topic, and therefore I'm now going to go vote for Donald Trump. It doesn't feel that way as I talk to members who are up for re-election, looking at their polling numbers, talking to voters. It just doesn't feel that way, both before the debate and after the debate.
Right. It's almost rare to find that single issue voter, and really what you said is, who understands what I'm going through and therefore has the tools to address it, I guess is what folks are feeling.
Yeah, when I was running campaigns for my bosses, I was always trying to think, can we run everything through the bumper sticker? How does this thing work through this? And I said, the problem right now is I think for this particular time where voters I think are just so concerned about how they feel, whether they feel safe in their neighborhood, crime, job safety, global safety, AI versus them, et cetera, is the Verizon ad, which is, Sprint. Can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. I think they're all asking, do you hear me now? Can you run with this? And I think there's a universe of people who don't care about Donald Trump's personal activities because they think he hears their larger concerns. Mm-hmm. I think there are people that feel that the Democrats and Harris hear what they're going through. And I think the fight is over. Do you hear me now? More than it is, I've got one topic that I think is going to get you comfortable. Because if it was one topic, I would have thought abortion would have been that.
Right.
I would have thought that would have just decided with, young women voters, women voters across, like I would have thought that would, and it just doesn't play that way. I don't think that's what we're seeing in the poll numbers and in the elections we've seen to date.
Right. It doesn't seem to have stuck the way that you may have expected it to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're at time, so maybe I'll end it there. But a big thank you for taking the time and sharing all of this with us. I've found it super insightful, and I'm sure folks who have tuned in are. So thank you also to folks who have tuned in to listen in, and yeah, really looking forward to your insights in the next few weeks and seeing what happens in November.
Yeah. See how wrong I am. That's the
No.
question, right? Well, that's the problem with doing these. You've now created a template where people can later come back and say, wait a minute, you said yes. Turns out Arizona was everything and we didn't even talk about it. Yeah. All right.
Well, we're
I
all going to
appreciate it.
Google. We're all going to Google Dearborn and Bucks County after this. So
All right. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope it's helpful.
thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.
Okay, bye, everyone. Have a good day.